Hello, and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care, and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we'll be speaking to a well-known guest to find out about how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm on the Marie Curie Couch with Will Eaves. Will is a writer and poet who's written 5 novels, 2 books of poetry, and 1 volume of literary essays. Will has appeared on BBC Radio 4's Start the Week and Open Book, and he's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Will Eaves, welcome to the Marie Curie Couch.
Thank you very much for having me, Jason. It's nice to be here.
And how are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you. I'm okay. Could do with a bit more sort of bright winter sunshine, but we might have to wait for that.
It's a bit grey today, isn't it?
It is a bit grey.
I'm going to jump straight in, Will, and ask if you can tell me about a significant bereavement that you've experienced in your life.
Well, I've been thinking about this since you asked me to come on this show, and really the choice was between, I suppose, what one might call an obvious candidate, my mother, who died in 2007, so 17 years ago now, and someone who died more recently. And I think I'm going to go with the person who died more recently 2 years ago, who was a school friend of mine called Eloise. And Eloise died of breast cancer, or rather of the secondary cancers that cropped up when her period of remission ended. And she died at the beginning of 2023, end of 2022. And she was a very significant figure in my formative adolescent life. A remarkable woman, extremely funny, very, very clever. I didn't know her before I was 16, but over 2 years in particular, 2 or 3 years, Eloise was a fantastic friend and a huge sort of social support, and came into my life at a significant time because I think, like a lot of adolescents, I'd had a so-so experience of school. Some good things. I was reasonably bright and there weren't many academic problems, but it was a big school, a big comprehensive school. I was very small. I felt quite self-conscious about my youthfulness and my outward demeanour, I suppose you might call it extroversion. I did a lot of plays and so on and was musical, was a bit of a mask for feelings that were rather more difficult for me to articulate or grapple with, feelings of, insecurity and invisibility, really. And then my voice broke at the end of my 5th year, and I felt I'd stepped into, rather wonderfully, across a threshold into the beginning of adult life. And as I moved into the 6th form, I suddenly found myself, and I think this sometimes happens at school, in a different environment with different friends from different parts of the city. I grew up in Bath, and a new part of my life very evidently started. And Eloise was a very big part of that because she was ebullient, extremely funny, very kind, social, but kind and understanding, and interested in a lot of the things I was interested in. The plays, music, telling jokes, having a comic persona, and literature. She was also an extremely good writer. And one of the key things I remember about Eloise, and one of the reasons she was so important to me, was that I credit her with teaching me how to write. I mean, I am now, for want of a better term, a writer. And we had a pretty consistent correspondence for about 2 or 3 years in which we wrote letters to each other every week. And they were long letters. These were pages long. And hers were fantastic dramatic monologues about the people she'd encountered working abroad. She was a campsite courier, as I was in France. And she had the ability to thumbnail situations and people in a comic dramatic style, including their dialogue, that really taught me as much, if not more, about how to write that kind of material as the best comic novels I've ever written. So I really feel that she, although she didn't go on to become a writer, was there at the inception of my feeling for literature, as well as being a wonderful friend and later on a fantastic mother and wife.
Thank you. And I have immediately felt quite moved that you've brought friendship. And I was curious as to where you and Eloise met.
That I find quite difficult to recall exactly. As I said, I grew up in Bath, and on the side of the city I went to school, there were two big comprehensives. There was Beech and Cliff, and then there was the girls' school, Hayesfield, and Eloise was at Hayesfield. In fact, she was a year ahead of me, so she was already in the upper sixth when I was moving into the sixth form. I have a feeling that we met properly at a mutual friend's party. Back in the lawless 80s, Jason, I have the feeling, although I'm not a parent myself, I'm not quite sure, I have to be careful about laying claim to understanding of what kids get up to now, because I really don't know. But I think that quite a lot of social activities are in some senses more circumscribed today, often for good reasons, than they were in the 80s. I mean, we were really trusted with an awful lot. Very rarely were we taken to events by our parents. We just went hither and yon on our own and walked back, at all hours. And it seemed to me that the parents in the picture were very, very graciously disposed to let us have the run of, a couple of rooms or even a house without really questioning very much. And I think in large part we didn't betray that trust. But I think I met Eloise at one of those parties, and it was the era of fantastically bad 80s music and leggings and big hair and the new romantics. And I'm sure we all looked an absolute sight. But I remember going to those parties and for the first time feeling that I wasn't too out of place at them. So I think it was at a party. And then we established a sort of ritual whereby the six of us who hung around together would go to each other's houses or meet up. And frankly, you go to the pub at the weekends. I was certainly underage. I was about 2 years underage. And I certainly didn't look 18, but Bath was quite a liberal place back then. No one asked any questions. And as I said, we didn't really betray anyone's trust particularly, and we weren't huge drinkers. But I think that we established this ritual of meeting up, and it was kind of quite charming and innocent, and we would have a few drinks and just all talk endlessly and go for walks. So we'd walk along the canal. I think of it as a sort of idyllic late childhood, and by a country mile much happier than the previous 5 years, where there'd been a bit of bullying and I'd not really been very sure of myself, and just those aspects of early adult childhood or adolescence can be difficult for a lot of people. But I felt that this group of people really, they were the portal into a new sense of self that was less insecure.
I think that, we could talk about this I could talk about this for a long time, but I'm going to kind of move forward in time, I think, from the 80s up to the early 2020s. I know it was the end of 22, early 23, you said, when, end of 22, when Eloise died. And she had a breast cancer diagnosis. Can I ask, were there any conversations between you both about death and her illness and dying?
There weren't conversations directly one-on-one. There was a very significant visit a couple of years before the return of the cancer. So I think she was first diagnosed with breast cancer and had a double mastectomy probably 4 years or so before she died, around about 2018. And I wasn't there for that, as it were, but after she'd had the operation and recovered, after chemo and the operation and the whole 9 yards, she had a year, 18 months of very significant and very healthy remission, in which she, as she put it to me, she said yes to everything. She was a galvanizing person, and she worked for a health charity herself, looking after a lot of elderly people near Guildford. And she was a great organizer of events and activities. She was I'm not sure what her official title was, whether she was CEO or whether she was director of this particular small trust. But that was the kind of thing she did. She was very used to being an organizer. So for her to say that she then said yes to everything meant that she was taking on an extraordinary range of activities, getting interested in political lobbying, meeting new people, doing new things, everything except skydiving, it seemed. And I think it may be the case that perhaps she partly exhausted herself doing that. But it was a very, very important conversation about seizing the moment that we had when she came to visit me. She said, this is not a direct quote, it's a paraphrase, "You've got one life. Don't hang around." And she didn't say this sententiously or ceremoniously. She said, just do the thing you want to do, because the end result for all of us will be the same. So there isn't time to muck around. And I'm still, by nature, although I know, reasonably confident and certain of my sentence structure, I'm actually a sort of bundle of nerves, and I find it quite difficult to do things. I'm not really a risk taker. And I felt that I was encountering someone who suddenly had a different view of risk because of her diagnosis, and because she knew in all likelihood her lifespan was going to be limited. She could have had a remission of 10, 15 years, but a lot of those serious cancers do come back. And I feel I'm still making my way to some life decisions that will have their origin in that visit to me by Eloise around about 2019, when she told me not to waste time.
How did you learn of Eloise's death?
I heard from her sister, Tessa, when I was at work. I work for a literary newspaper, and I remember that my phone went as I was in the sort of lobby between elevators, and I saw that it was Tessa, and I knew immediately, before Tessa said anything, that of course Eloise died, because she was in a hospice by that point, and there were no more visits, and she just wanted her family around her. So I knew what Tessa was going to say. And a little bit of me, or actually quite a large part of me, was relieved on her behalf, because of course she was in great pain. She was very comfortable. I believe it was a marvellous hospice. I can't remember its name, in or near Guildford. And she was certainly by that point, obviously part of palliative care, and palliative care is very well done for the most part. So her pain would have been numbed, but it's still difficult, isn't it, Jason? Because I know this from seeing my mother die. You are watching a person trying to find their way out of the room of life, and no one can do that for them. And there is a silent, inexpressible struggle going on to loosen the ties of life so that the person can find some release. And it's a difficult thing to capture in words, but some degree of solitude, I feel, for that person is necessary at the time, or the people around them kind of keep them in the room when they're ready to go. And she said a very beautiful thing in a letter to us all a few weeks before she died, talking about acceptance of her condition. She was at peace with it. And she said, "I've had a lovely life, and I don't want to cling on to its last shreds." And it was a statement of great simplicity and grace.
And I think also when you're diagnosed with a terminal illness, you're told there's no more cure and you're going to receive palliative care, supportive care. Then if you have some time, and of course not everybody does, then you can start quite early on with loosening those threads you mentioned. But I think, yeah, it's quite an image, thinking about the hospice room and or the hospital room and or the living room, bedroom, wherever it is, where someone's dying at the end and there are family around. And I think that kind of need for solitude, maybe not only for the person who's dying, but for those who are sitting with them as well. And yeah, I mean, I suppose the hope is that that's a really special time. Of course, we know that's not always the case.
Not always the case. And these things are difficult to, they are fundamentally difficult to control because we have no control over them. It is that confrontation with the thing we can't avoid, that we can't mitigate, and that is our mortality. I think if there was one thing I would say to anyone going through this, listening to this podcast, it would be, maybe don't worry too much about being there for the final moment, because you are there. You are there in the orbit of the person who is dying, your loved one. And it's not really when or where or the precise moment or the last look or the last words that matter as much as the overall sense of bearing someone in mind and being with them sort of meditatively, as it were. I heard about my mother's death when I was back in London. I'd been going back and forth to London, and I wasn't with Eloise, and I felt that none of that mattered. What mattered was a difficult to encapsulate presence of mind that in some strange way is or was shared.
And I love that thought of us being there in the orbit. And thank you for that as well. And thank you for saying that, because I know lots of people who are listening, it's often a big struggle for people when they weren't there. I wasn't there, or I couldn't get there, or I just left the room.
I feel very strongly that doesn't matter. I'm going to say that doesn't matter. And I think that guilt that people sometimes feel, it's important to remember that guilt is, it's a more or less entirely useless emotion, because it doesn't help us make anything better, or it's completely stuck in the past. It doesn't help us improve a situation or come to a new understanding of ourselves or other people. So I think that everyone must find their own way to dealing with the loss of a loved one, and it often takes, many turns around the block and an iteration of different rituals and carrying on with life and carrying on with your job, and sometimes revelations about that person's significance or about your own role in the last few years or weeks or days come unbidden at a much later stage. There's no time frame for that. But I think the regret for not being there is something that we can usefully think about letting go.
Marie Curie's mission is to close the gap in end-of-life care. We're here for anyone with an illness they're likely to die from, and those close to them. Whatever the illness, wherever you are, we're with you to the end. Find out more at mariecurie.org.uk.
Can you tell me about your experience of bereavement and grief after both your mum's death and Eloise's? And if you could maybe touch on what you found helpful in your grief.
Well, okay, I'll say a little bit about both, maybe, about both women. My experience of bereavement in Eloise's case has been, I don't want to overstate my connection with her, if you see what I mean. I felt that she was extremely significant in my life. I suspect that I was less significant. Well, I know I was less significant in hers, and that's fine, because she went on, she had a family, our lives took us in different directions. When she died, I felt the loss greatly, but I also felt enormous gratitude for having known her. And I wrote a few things memorialising her for my own comfort, really, and not to be shared. I also wrote a more public thing about her last year's, but that was different. So my sense of bereavement with Eloise was largely directed towards a feeling for her children. I'm not going to mention their names because I think that's slightly overstepping the mark, but they were young adults when Eloise died. Her eldest was, I think, 21, and her daughter was 18, I think. So they were just launched, if you like, and they were models of self-possession and calm, contained emotion at her memorial, which was a beautiful event. And my sense of the loss was tempered by a feeling that she'd done a good thing. She'd produced these very self-possessed, extremely adult children who were good to go, as it were. There's so little that actually even the best parents can do to safeguard or guarantee the futures of their children. That's the truth. You know, you can teach them to eat properly, and you can do a number of things, but everyone's life is going to have some difficulty in it. And really, the big sign of a competent person is, as it were, seeing them in the half distance and thinking to yourself, that person's going to have difficulties. They're going to struggle like everyone at some point. But there is a core of solid self-possession which will probably see them through. It's like a reactive core that's strong enough and is producing enough energy and self-support to see them through whatever difficulties they face. And I felt that very strongly about looking at both her children. And so my sense of grief was tempered by my confidence in them. The situation with my mother was different. And I think that actually that has been altogether more difficult for me in long term, in that I was not perhaps as close to my mother as, one might expect for a gay man of the 80s. She was a very interesting woman. She was complex, emotionally complex, and I think quite melancholy. And I think she never did many of the things it was in her to do. And I think she was partly constrained by her cultural environment and her background. She had dementia, so those 7 years were tough at the end. But I was very relieved when she finally died, because I felt that her suffering was over. And I felt that was a good thing. And so the bereavement that I felt for a while after was really a more selfish condition to do with my sense of not having been as close to her as I might have been, not as much of a support as perhaps I could have been. My father is still alive. It was a very long marriage, but not without its difficulties. I don't think she was always very happy in it. And I think that she was of the generation of women, many of whom were very committed to having a family, but struggled with being able to say that the demands of bringing up that large family meant that they had very little room for themselves and very little right, as they saw it, to ask for space for themselves and for their own interests. And I feel she would have been a happier person if she'd worked more and if she'd been able to develop that side of herself that was so talented as a draftswoman and teacher. So the loss of my mother was, it wasn't so much my loss that counted for me as the loss of a person who I felt had been a little unhappy. And that transferred itself in some way. And I had all sorts of mysterious physical pain to deal with for many, many years after my mother's death. And I think that was a kind of absorbed emotional regret that I hadn't been old enough or wise enough to be supportive and to encourage her in the things that I knew she loved doing.
I think that manifested itself physically somehow.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
You've already talked about writing, certainly writing for Eloise, writing personally, not to be shared for yourself, but also writing something that was public. It sounds like that is something that was helpful for you. Is there anything else? And I'm thinking about people listening who might be bereaved now. Is there anything else that you found helpful or find helpful in your grief?
Well, I think music is a solace for a lot of people. And also doing something new, learning something new, or returning to an activity, and it really doesn't matter what it is, that you may have let go in early life. So feeling something coming back online, being reborn in your awareness. For me, it was writing music and playing the piano again, which I hadn't done for a long while. And I played the piano a lot when I was knocking around Bath with Eloise. You know, I used to play for various concerts, badly, I might add. But it's something that I let go when I went to university. I also used to write little pieces. And I took it up again after Eloise died. And I felt that revisiting of a very happy period in a practical way was a very, very good conduit for, you know, the adrenaline that actually... one of the things about bereavement is you can feel you can feel alternately very adrenalized by grief and also sort of depressed by it. And the two things go together. It's like having a lot of coffee. There's a sort of hit of the activity, which means you're sort of absolutely invested in the loss of the person. And then there's the collapse afterwards. And I found that doing something new or something long familiar but buried in the past and making it come alive again was a good way of taking some of the strain of that roller coaster of emotion. Yeah, so I'd say that doing something new or taking up an old activity and being practically active about something and not necessarily to do with the person at all. You know, it might be gardening, it might be drawing, it might be making new friends, it might be walking, it could be anything. But a practical physical activity that points you in a slightly new direction is a good conduit for the complex emotions that crop up in bereavement.
Yeah, I think that's a really good advice. I was thinking of the roller coaster and actually doing something new and doing those activities and or doing a activity might not necessarily absorb the weight of the highs and lows or the hit, but there's something about leveling out.
Yeah. I think it's a handrail, isn't it? It's a guide.
Yeah.
You can't circumvent the unexpectedness of life and the emotional unexpectedness, but you can sometimes find handholds that will just sort of point you in the right direction or maintain some sort of equilibrium.
Oh, I really like the handrail. Yeah, thank you. Okay. I'm going to change tack and ask Will if you ever think about your own death.
I do. Yes, I think about my own death, and I think I am absolutely sure of its inevitability. And I think, like many people, it is not the fact of death that concerns me so much as the manner of dying, the progressive debility that will lead to the death and the inevitability of that. I think that's the hard part. I'm at that age, I'm 56, where you are beginning to get a sense of the body's coming frailty. It's not with me yet, but just in that small way that once you move past the threshold of middle age and you see certain things don't put themselves right in the way they used to, little aches and pains don't go away, the warning signs are there. My approach, I'm trying to be practical about it. My approach is to not run from that awareness, but to try and sit with it. I have a sort of meditative practice. It's not an extensive one. I try to sit on my own for 20 minutes, half an hour before I go to bed, just with a candle and not think about anything particularly, which is quite difficult to do. What you find in meditation, and I've done a few little retreats in places, is that the mind is active anyway, and you may find yourself actually thinking quite concertedly about one thing. But the trick is not to worry too much about it. And as soon as you become aware of the thinking, you sort of let it go. And then there's a period of emptiness again. And my sense of the purpose of meditation is it introduces you to a larger scale sense of transience, a larger scale sense of life being something that arises and then goes, ultimately. And that this is both realistic and calming, and it's like the breath. You inhale for a period, we are here, it's a miracle that we're here at all, and then it's over. And that's the way it has always been. So, for me, dealing with my mortality and the sense that I'm only here for a short period, I am trying, not always successfully, to root it in something very, very basic, which is the transience of day-by-day activities. You get up, you have your day, you sit down, and then you lie down, you go to bed. And that's a very, very ancient metaphor for life, is the passing of the day. It's biblical, it's Hebrew, it's as old as we are as a species. So that's my way of thinking about it.
The transience of life and the transience of the day. Yeah. One of the reasons I asked that question about thinking about your own death, one of the aims of our podcast is to not only encourage conversations around death and dying, but what we know is that if people, on a practical level maybe, if people plan for the future, think about the future, as in their death, the outcomes for those who are left behind can sometimes be better. So one practical example of that is writing a will, because then if those things are sorted, then when the person dies, for those who are left behind and grieving and managing their own grief and looking for ways to support themselves and each other through that, and they might not have to worry too much about all the financial stuff because lots of it would have been covered by the will and sorted.
I think that's a very good point. And actually, I did finally make my will last year. I'd been meaning to do it for a few years and I hadn't got around to it. And I finally did it last year. Although I have to say, it seems a funny thing to laugh about. I'm actually beginning to think I need to simplify some. There are rather too many instructions, or sort of, subdivisions of what, let me tell you, will be a very, very small pot of money when I go. And I want 5% of it to go to this conservation charity. It'll end up being about 25p. But anyway, I think it is a very good idea. And there's a lot of respectable research, as I'm sure you're aware, that says that, funny enough, if you make a will, it's not quite that you live longer, but it does seem to have a pronounced and beneficial psychological effect. As well as making it easier for the people who are left behind, as you pointed out, I think it's very beneficial for the person who will die, because that part of the whole mortal problem has been laid to rest already. It's taken care of.
Yeah. And you can have a say in what you want because it's written down. Yeah. Is legacy something that's important to you, or something you've given thought to, as in how you might like to be remembered?
That's a very interesting question. I think this varies enormously between people. So before I say what I'm going to say, I do not in any way think that my response necessarily represents anyone else's. This is in a way the most personal question, because I both feel that, I've spent my career, such as it is, writing things, not with any great financial success, but I have written now 10 books, and I'm pleased I've had the chance to do that. I feel very fortunate. And of course, you write to begin with out of a certain vanity. There is vanity attached to writing. It's built in. You feel there's something you want to say and you would like it to be read by others and to exist artifactually, as a book. So it's no good denying that there is vanity built into creativity, because it's actually an important part. You can't get to do it unless you have a certain degree of self-regard, actually. But at the same time, you want it to last and you want it to be there. At the same time, I don't think it will last at all. And I think that it will all be forgotten. And the interesting thing that as you go on writing and you grow up, you realise you're doing it because it's an interesting habit. And it interests you to do it while you are alive. And it's a part of living. And it's not really about the legacy. The legacy thing, you're soon disabused of the notion that you're going to leave any of that behind for future generations. If you went to an actuary and asked for odds on whether any of your books will be read in the future, you would not get any. So, to that extent, it will all go. It's, as Ecclesiastes says, it's all vanity, says the preacher. That's what it is. So I both think it's important to think honestly about one's legacies, what you want to leave, what you want to do now for people, and at the same time to be able to say to yourself, it is all going to go, and I will go with it because there are millions of people on this planet, and there's no reason why I should be particularly special. And this is not a matter for enormous regret. This is the truth, and it is human, and it is natural. And the loss of self and the loss of memory on other people's part of you is not a huge threat to something, to the order or to the significance of your life while you've had it. Because the significance of your life is that it's a vastly unlikely and wonderful miracle. So that's what I think about legacy.
Great answer. Thank you. Okay, my last question is, how has it been being on the Marie Curie Couch today and having these conversations, or this type of conversation?
Really lovely. Really lovely. I'm sure people have said this to you before, Jason, but you're a very good listener. And, doing your job, rather like teaching, which I've been for quite a bit of my life, is mostly about listening. I tend to talk too much. I'd be a better teacher if I listened more. I'd probably be a better writer if I listened more. But it's been lovely. And it's been very nice to remember someone who meant so much and to be able to face the fact that, she no longer has her voice. So it's nice if someone who thought well of her and who loved her can say some good things on her behalf.
Will Eaves, thank you for joining me on the Marie Curie Couch. Thank you for taking me back to my teens in the 80s. Thank you for sharing some of Eloise's life and your mum's. It's been great.
Thank you very much, Jason. It's been wonderful.
So that's all for this episode of On the Marie Curie Couch. We hope it's got you thinking about matters of life and death, and perhaps starting those conversations with your own friends and family. Marie Curie's here to help, from planning ahead to coping with bereavement. You can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 090 2309 or search Marie Curie online. The podcast is produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Content. The music featured is Time Lapse by Pan-Oceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.